Hey everyone, in this video I am going to be walking you through how I made these Marvel Snap-like cards, and I changed it up to be kind of anime characters instead. As you can see, we have Goku, Power from Chainsaw Man, and then we have Zoro from One Piece. And the reason I kind of created these was just to show the power of scriptable objects and how easy it would be, because I mentioned in a previous video that after you're kind of done all the heavy lifting and setup, the way that Marvel Snap engineered their cards and the way they work, it's actually quite simple to then give the kind of template or layout over to a designer, and they can just go through your scriptable object, insert a couple images, and the card would just render as you would expect, and all the different effects and upgrades that would happen the same on every card. So let's just jump into it. Okay, so back in Unity, which they're all currently Zoro because that's just what I left it at as the default, or the last one I was working on. Really the only difference between these three prefabs is the card in here, which is a scriptable object, and that's kind of showing as Power, this one's Goku, and this one's Zoro. So if I hit play, when the card loads, it's going to pull in all the data off the scriptable object, and then it'll render as you see here. So I'm going to try and not make this a long tutorial and get into too much detail, but if there's anything specific that you want to know that I don't cover in this video, just feel free to throw something down in the comments and then I can revisit it in the future. So just quickly here, looking at this, you can tell a couple things. So the names I all have animating with the kind of the highlight going across, which I ended up liking a little better than the Marvel Snap version. Other than that, so you can see also the space background animating through the borders. Zoro and Goku kind of have some background animations or particle effects, whereas Power is more kind of highlighting the movement shader, which is basically you can just color along the image wherever you think there should be movement, and then it'll kind of sway in the wind or give that illusion. Goku has it as well in his hair, and then Zoro has it on his band and the wrap around his waist. And they all have a follow mouse script up here, which basically wherever I move my mouse, the cards will just look at it or face towards it. And that's just to kind of highlight the 3D effect, which could be done kind of multiple ways. I feel like the Marvel Snap game actually does the 3D part a little bit better. This kind of just looks like flat planes essentially on different levels moving, which is exactly what it is. And I believe Marvel Snap does something similar. There's just a little bit, I think I'm missing a piece here where it kind of keeps it facing towards the camera at all times, whereas mine actually fully tilt. So if we're going to dive into this, just get rid of 2 of these and focus more on one card at a time. And let's break this card down. So if you hold Alt and click this arrow here, that will make sure it all expands out and down to every child. And same way, if you hold Alt and click it again and then open it up, you'll see it's collapsed them all. So that's a neat little trick if you need to get into looking at something. And that works for basically everywhere. So even if I were to open up all these in here and then you're like, oh, there's too much stuff open, you just Alt click this, then open it back up and it's all neatly cleaned up again. So looking at this card, let's break down kind of the easier stuff first. So the frame down here is like I'm kind of just talking about the I have the cost and the power, and those are pretty straightforward. They're just kind of 2 sprite images there, and these just have Text Mesh Pro on it with a custom snap font, which I just grabbed an open font online and just found anything that looked remotely close to what I would think was comparable to Marvel Snaps. Other than that, let's go up to the frame mask. The frame mask, you see the sprite here, frame. There's a sprite mask sitting on this object here. And if we open that frame, this is what it looks like. It's just a white border and everything else is transparent. So that's going to act as our mask. And then inside of it, we have this frame, which is the basic frame here. And it looks like this. So normally you wouldn't need it to be a mask in this scenario, but because I knew later on, once the card gets to a certain level, the frame starts to animate itself. There's kind of two parts, two levels where the frame will animate. So that's why this is set up as a mask. Otherwise, if you weren't going to be animating or making the frame itself move at all, then you wouldn't need that step. You can just use this basic frame as is, as a normal sprite. So next, moving down into the middle layer, that's kind of where the bulk of all the effects are going to be. We have the middle mask. Let's start there. Similar thing. There's just going to be a sprite image that looks like this, where it's all white, and that's specifying where to show kind of content. So if I go to the background, you'll see that there's something called mask interaction. It's currently set to visible inside of the mask. If I click none, you'll see that this is what the image looks like without kind of having the mask being applied. And if I were to do visible outside the mask, it's basically the opposite of kind of what we have, where it's only visible when it's not touching the mask part. But for our purposes, you always want the background to be visible inside the mask. Okay, so I just switched it from 2D to 3D just to kind of highlight this a little bit. And if I hit play, alright, so I have that set up as Goku still. So if I go to card prefab, open up the Scriptable Objects and just drag in Zoro, and hit play, it'll load Zoro's Scriptable Object instead. So here we go. You can see the Z value of these making the background a little bit further away changes that depth perspective. And if I look at it there, you can see like the bottom isn't even showing. So hopefully that kind of highlights that point there. And then the name is in front of Zoro, and the sword itself is its own layer, and then that sword is actually visible outside of the mask, and that's how you get that one piece outside of the card where everything else is inside of the card. So that is quite literally just this character move. I tried to make some, the naming here is not great, so kind of ignore that, but the character move itself is supposed to represent any part of the character that may move or leave the card. So in this instance, it's a sword, and you can see here the mask interaction is none. And that's how we control the effect on the frame break. It basically goes from this to this, and then it breaks out of the card itself. There is also an expansion of the character scale-wise. So the default one, everything's inside the card, and it's like slightly smaller, and then when does the frame break, the scale increases, and anything that should be outside of the card loses the mask interaction. And that's all scripted. The character base is Zoro himself, which is everything here without the sword. The title, pretty self-explanatory there as well. Everything there is just completely done through a shader, so that's not a mask with something moving behind it, similar to how I've been doing the other effects. That one is actually completely controlled through a shader. And then I have some kind of placeholder parts. So depending on the card, like I said, maybe a designer has an effect they want to put on it, or two effects, or particle effects, or maybe multiple particle effects. You can kind of customize these cards however you like. So if we were to go into look at Zoro, you can see here, these are all the things that map over into each one of these. So if I click Zoro, that's what he looks like right there. Go back here. This is the mask of Zoro. So I'm going to open up the shader and walk through that. But essentially what I'm doing here is marking anything white on top of where I would want anything to be moving. So you can see this is his hair, and it gets whiter near the edges. So this will kind of subtly move, similar to his little band there and the wrap going around his waist. So anything that you see here is going to be impacted by my shader that essentially moves the image around. So that's my mask. Then the character add-on is basically the sword in this instance, which is just the sword extracted out from the rest of the image. And then I don't have a map for that. If, for example, the sword was in fact clothing or something that I wanted to be on the outside of the card, then I would also have an additional map there to do that same effect. The name is just this, just Zoro, and the background as well. So that's all the assets that make up the card. And then we also have these kind of two particle effects. So particle 1, particle 2. The way that this works is there's petals that move in front of Zoro, and then there's petals that move behind Zoro to give that illusion of depth. If I bring the petals into the scene, you can see this is essentially what it is. I won't get too into particle effects in this video, but you can see from this what's kind of going on here. And then inside of the renderer, there's the same kind of concept here where you can set masking. So right now there's no masking. If I put inside the mask, it'll only show when it's inside of the card, which in this case it's not inside of a mask, it's sitting outside, so it just won't render because it's only going to show inside of a mask. Whereas if I were to make this outside, it works the exact same as no masking because there's just no mask. And for the Zoro card, there's just basically two of these, one in the background, one in the foreground, again just to give that illusion of depth. Other than that, the only thing that really changes is the order and layer and the animation. I called it animation Z, which I'm not quite sure why I named it that to begin with, but basically that's really just controlling the Z value for each of these objects. So if I go here, you can see the background's animation Z is 2, which is the furthest back. So it's kind of the opposite to what you would expect this to be. The higher the number, the further into the background it goes. So they each have their own animation Z background. So the sword is, sorry, the add-on here. So the sword is going to be slightly in front of the character itself to also give that slight delay in movement between the two. So Zoro moves, but the sword kind of moves less, giving a feel there as well. If you really focus on his hand, you can see the jittering of the two things are detached. And that basically covers how the scriptable objects interact with the card itself, and that's how they change. Those are the different aspects that will change from card to card. So I just want to dig into the card itself. If I open up this script, actually before I open up the script, let's touch on kind of some of these parts here. So for the rarity colors, you can see I have an array of colors, and basically it just goes from gray to green, blue, purple, to orange. And then these last two ones I just ignore because that's when it becomes animated. And then I have a different piece of code that's controlling that, which essentially moves into Ultra, which I just kind of grabbed this funky looking picture online, and I'm not quite sure what they use in Marvel Snap. I just try to take a close guess. Something along these lines is what I imagine. And for the infinite part, I just took this kind of galaxy picture. And the other one here is the shine. And the shine's quite kind of simplistic here, where it's just 3 lines, the middle line being stronger than the other 2. And I can kind of highlight that a little bit on this one. I think Zoro's the hardest character to notice it, but that's what those 3 lines are, kind of just scrolling from left to right. And then kind of give it some length here in terms of the image, just to control how frequently they come. So if I made this really, really small, basically it would loop, and the second it went off, it would reappear again. So kind of creating this extra space on both sides of the image gives it that delay between when the next time it will appear again. Okay, so that kind of covers all the things that are going to be inputted from the outside. So let's take a look at the card attributes script itself. So you can see this is where I set up the card. If we control click into the card, you'll see I have the character base, character map, all the things that I kind of showed through the scriptable object. If you've never seen scriptable objects before, there's lots of different tutorials online, so I would recommend checking that out. And then I have the rarity enum up here of all the different types the card could be. I have the snap sprite, which is just made up of the sprite, the boolean, whether or not this should interact with the mask or not, float, which is marked animation Z, which should just kind of be like Z index or something along those lines. That's essentially what it is. It's just controlling what the Z value should be once the frame break, no, not the frame break, once the 3D part happens. And then the order in the layer. And then we just have the snap map, which is the texture, speed, strength, and these are just going to impact the shader. So the reason that I have this kind of on top of here, the create asset menu, is that allows you to kind of quickly make new scriptable objects. So if we wanted to create a new one, you just go right click, create, and it'll create this card up here at the top. If I click that, this creates a new scriptable object. And then I can basically, this is where I was kind of talking about earlier again, that you could just take a couple sprites that your designers made, so the actual character, anything that's going to be moving or appear outside of the card, you can put in the name, the background you want for them, and any particle effects or effects that you want to happen. So you just check those in, put some Z-index stuff, frame break, which layers they should be on, and then that's essentially your new card already done. They're all going to follow the same basic blueprint. And then you just take this one and then you check it in there, and then that's your new card. I'm going to do that. I'm just going to delete this for now. If I go back here to the card attribute, again, or not just an array of colors. Okay, so then let's get into the other parts of the code. So on awake, it's going to call this setup card references. And basically this is going to, off of this current transform, so this is where the script is on the game object, it's going to look down the hierarchy for a frame mask frame, middle mask background, blah, blah, blah. Basically it's just looking and setting up all of these things here to match all the various sprite renders that I'm going to be swapping out, which basically is just mapping out to, so frame mask frame, it's going to grab that one, middle mask background, grab this one. So it does that right off the bat and just sets a reference for all of them. Then I destroy all the particles that currently exist on it, and then I instantiate new particles based off of the ones from the card. That's set up card references, and then update card. And then update card is going to set the card values, set frame break, set 3D, set title shine, set animation, or set frame color. So let's start with the set card values. So what this is going to do is basically just map all the stuff on the card over into those references that we just set up. So the character base sprite is going to match the card's character base sprite, so on and so forth. So these are all just mapping the values into the card, into this prefab essentially, and setting up all those different values. Once we move into the frame break part, basically it's going to first set all of the mask interactions to being visible inside the mask. So this is kind of the base part, is that they will all be within the card. And then if the rarity is above uncommon, the various parts that should no longer be visible inside the mask will switch over to being none, assuming that the frame break part is checked. And the reason I do this for all these different steps is it's going to follow the same pattern of set it to the default, and then if it is above uncommon, set it to being the frame break. It's just a way that I find to work easier for me to make sense of. That way, if someone were to, if you wanted to change scriptable objects on the fly, like change the cards in and out in runtime, it would call this code again and it would set them back to the default, right? You don't want to get into the instance where you change the scriptable object out to something else and it's no longer above rarity uncommon, but because you didn't reset it back, it's now showing it looking like things are broken out, like it had already done the frame break effect when that card shouldn't be showing it. Okay, so then we go into set the 3D. So this is a similar concept here. Even though I kind of did this a little bit strange, I think. So I create all these floats, set them all to 0. If the rarity is above rare, I then set all of these to being what the card's animation Z is. And then I go into all these local positions and I set them all to be the X and Y of what they were before, but now it's going to have these new Z values instead of the current Z values that it has. So again, basically what's happening here is if they're not above rarity rare, they're all 0, they're all in the same plane, it looks like a flat card. If they're set to being 3D, it takes all the animation Z values, which I explained before, kind of they're going to range from negative values to positive values, which is just going to set up how far away from the camera it is. And that just creates that layer of depth. And then it just sets them all onto those various local positions. All right, next for the frame color. So what this is doing here is just mapping the rarity to the rarity color. So if I click rarity, you can see that that's an enum, which is common, uncommon, rare, blah, blah, blah. And if I hover it, you'll see rarity common is 0, 1, 2. So there's a value when you make an enum to each of these. And then if that matches up with the array I have, so I have this rarity colors, which is just an array, I'm using the rarity as an index to pick the color of this array that I have. And then I set the frame texture to be null. And then these are the two last ones where the frame itself is going to change. So if the rarity is equal to ultra, set the texture to being the ultra texture. If the rarity is infinity, set the texture to being the infinity texture. So it's setting the texture of the frame texture to be ultra or infinity. And what that means is on this frame, I have the material frame material, which if I click that, and if I were to drop one of those textures onto it, for example, the infinity, I put it on the frame texture, you'll see it looks like this. And when you're in the editor and it's the shader's trying to move it, if you move your mouse around, you'll see it kind of then we have the set title shine. And this is similar concept here where everything gets set back to null. If the rarity is above legendary, set the intensity to 2, and then set the texture of shine to shine, and that'll start the texture moving across. Again, just to quickly look at that, if you go to title material, just drag this out. So this chunk here of the frame material, this is the title material, and what's happening is the shine is just going to get this is going to get applied to it. So same concept there. You can see now the title is getting that shine effect applied to it. And then for set animation, again, everything goes to 0. Stop all the particle effects. If the rarity is above epic, then set all of the strengths equal to the card's speed and strength, and then turn on any of the particle effects, and then map those over to the materials itself. And then the increase bloom, lerp bloom, decrease bloom, all that stuff is just part of the animations to handle moving from one level to another. And that was just for display purposes. That had nothing to do with the actual card itself. So you can basically ignore those. That covers all the different steps of moving the card through the levels. So the only things left to really cover now is just the shaders that I have. So let's look at the two shaders. So there's a frame shader and then there's the title shader. So again, I'll extract that out just to make that a little bit neater. So I never like showing these shaders because I find this is really a difficult thing to explain or teach. At least for me anyways, it's hard to explain shader graph in general just because it looks like spaghetti. But I'll try my best here to kind of do a walkthrough. Otherwise, you can just pause the video here and look at all the different nodes I have and just copy it out if you want to create it yourself. I will not be kind of linking any of these files just because I took a lot of those images instead of making them myself. Had I made the images myself and drew everything, I'd make it available, but for now, I'm just going to reference the sources I use and just not publish this. We have the texture coming in, which in this case is the frame itself. And the color here, which is the color. So basically, if they are on all these stages prior to the frames animating, then it's really just going to take this path here. And that's kind of the easy case. There's going to be, this is the base image. It's going to get multiplied by a color. So here you can see the sample 2D texture, which is just the frame that I showed earlier, and it's grayscale. So anywhere you see kind of the grays, you'll get darker greens. If it were to be black, then it would be completely void of green. And anywhere that's white will be kind of as green as possible. And this is where you're going to get that bloom effect coming through. And then to do the animating through the frame, anytime you see anything moving through shader, typically that's going to involve the time node. And then I'm multiplying it by this kind of constant here, which I could extract out into a variable. I just chose not to. This seemed to work fine for the kind of the speed that it was going. It doesn't really change on a per card basis, so I just left it static. And then what I do here is I get from the main texture, I get the normal for that texture. It's kind of hard to see here, but you can see this is the main border here. And right below it, there's a tiny line here that's kind of impacting the way that the stars move across it. And it kind of breaks up the movement there. And you can see a little bit better if you focus on the card itself. It just gives a little extra layer of depth I found. So I add that together, and then the output of that goes into the offset of tiling and offset. And it's both set to 1, 1. And then in here, I just have the frame texture, which is going to be the infinity one or the other one that I showed. And all it's going to do is just essentially tile that slowly through the frame. And then lastly, that will get multiplied by any color that is set here and then added into the base color. All right, so that is the frame shader. That one is relatively straightforward. And lastly, the title shader. Okay, so this one's going to be almost identical to the other shader, just a couple extra steps. So I guess to start off, we have the main texture coming in, which is just this the picture for Goku. And again, I have one going out to get the normal from that, and it looks like this. And it just gives, again, it just gives that little bit of depth to the image. And then same thing here, we're going to do time. We're going to multiply that by some kind of constant number, and that's going to control the speed at which the tiling and offset will happen. And then I run it into a vector 2. I don't quite remember why I did this now. I'm sure I had a reason at the time, but a lot of this was kind of just playing around with shader graph to get the effect that I wanted. And then I add those together, and then the output comes through to the offset, so similar to what I did in the other shader. And then here you can see from the tiling and offset, I go into an add and then a rotate, which I don't think I even have to do this add, to be honest. That might have been just another kind of tinkering around. So if I delete that and move this here, it should give me the same looking effect. The only thing I rotate it for is just to slightly turn the effect, because without it, it just kind of looks like these three lines. So yeah, that all outputs, and then I get the shine texture, and that's going to map the UV of how it should behave and move. And then basically the color from the sample texture gets mapped or multiplied by this, and then the alpha from that also comes down to the alpha to make sure that it clips out any. Hopefully that made sense. I kind of butchered the explanation of all that. And I know I said lastly, but I forgot another shader that is on the character itself. So if I open up other, there should be another card shader. So this is the last shader, the character itself, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated. Okay, so for this effect, basically there's a couple of ways you could have done it. I looked at some tutorials online and I found one which I will link below because I kind of like that effect the most, where it does this kind of ripple effect out. So I won't explain too much about this other than I've separated these out into ripple, and I'll link the video and you can follow that to get a better explanation of how this effect really works. But basically what's happening here is you're going to get this ripple effect starting down from the middle. You're going to get the normal of it, and this is going to apply to the tiling and offset, so you get this kind of ripple out on top of like any image you would want. I'm going to grab the position, normal from height, and the tiling offset from my character, and then I apply the mask to that as well. So this is the mask for Goku, and you can see here like I have the hair part of him is the parts that move. Anywhere that's black will be completely still. Anywhere that has any sort of white will be affected by this effect. So that's kind of what I mapped as the mask. And then I use this blurb, which is basically what's going to happen here is anywhere that's black is going to use the kind of the default position and normal. Anything that is not black is going to then be affected by all this ripple effect here. Then that is going to map into the UV of the texture itself. And again, those are going to map out into the base color and the alpha. So you can see here I have the values kind of ramped up, and you can see his hair and everything is a little bit more exaggerated. But when you actually get into the card, it's quite brought down. And that's it. I know that was probably quite lengthy compared to what I wanted to do. I just want to do a quick recap of it, close this off, just because I didn't want to leave this open, and I have a couple of other projects that I'm still trying to wrap up as well. I know I really enjoyed working on this side project, and hopefully this walkthrough was useful to someone. If you enjoyed it, click that thumbs up button, subscribe if you aren't already, and I will see you in the next video.